The topic for today is still what a theory is, but while we in the former lesson had a very abstract philosophical angle on these concepts of ontology and epistemology, what is a theory actually, how is it out there in the world, or is it constructed, and how certain can we be about our theories? That was the very sort of philosophical abstract level we were on. Here we will ask, so what is a theory actually in practice, and how do we create theoretical explanations? That's the aim for today. So we have the agenda for this particular video, these three items that we want to go through, and then another video on ontology, epistemology, and in the live sessions we'll be covering these issues here. Okay, first, what does a theory actually do? And it's noteworthy that in everyday conversation we tend to use the word theory as a hunch. I mean, we might have I have a theory that someone likes someone else. And so we can use it in this everyday kind of way. It's just speculation. While, as highlighted here in this New York Times article I've inserted a few quotes from, is that in science the word theory is not really taken lightly. It doesn't just mean a hunch or a guess. Something more systematic, something that ties together a bunch of facts as is written here. And we can also judge the quality of theories in terms of how they can help us, understand the world and guide us through territory. So we can test theories and we can advance them. So the map metaphor actually works quite well here. So in the past, Colombo thought that the map looked like this, and he didn't really, when he was trying to sail to go left, so to speak, and sail to India, he didn't really realize that North America was in the way. So his map, his theory of the world was wrong, so to speak. Well, we can have more updated and more advanced maps or theories about the world, and this is how we can improve over time. So theories do something. They help us. And theories can improve over time. But the key challenge of theories is that they are invisible in some sense. So British philosopher Hume is famous for this, for pointing out that we never really discover anything but one event following another. Or put differently, we never directly observe a force or power by which the cause operates, or any connection between it and its supposed effect, how that works. We don't see the causal connection. It's not like seeing, I don't know, a snooker ball and then another snooker ball, and then, well, suddenly something makes the other one move when it's being hit. We see the movements of each element, but we don't see the actual causal connection, whether it's gravity or any other kind of forces that are in play. So that's really a fundamental challenge. And just sort of another note on this is that there's a difference between not being able to see tangibly the constructs we're interested in, whether it's the construct of motivation or stock market price. We are trying to measure things that we're interested in the world, and discussion last time on the various ontologies and epistemologies was also about to what degree can we argue that whatever we're interested in the world is actually out there, and maybe we can claim that we can see that atom, we can take a picture of it. This is more difficult, for instance, with the concept of motivation. But theories are about the relations between different entities. The theory of gravity is the relation between two things that are happening, or a theory of motivation is about how incentives might drive higher motivation and thus better performance. Or the theory of efficient market hypothesis is not just sort of saying this is a stock price, it's saying something about how these prices might evolve over time. So just to be clear, that constructs can also in some way be invisible if we think we can't measure them or see them directly. But here with theories, we're interested in the relations between something. Something is happening upon something else. And it's this relation that we want to understand. And as Hume is pointing out, often stuff is happening in the world where we can't sort of see it as such. It's invisible in some sense. But then explaining what theory is can actually be quite a bit challenging. So that's why there is a fairly famous paper by Sutton and Storr that tries to highlight, well, what is theory not? So I mean, okay, it might be difficult to see what a theoretical relation is. It's not always visible as such in a traditional sense, but So we want to understand what a theory is, but that's challenging, that's difficult. I'll get to that in just a second. What Sutton and Stahl here are doing is they're highlighting what theory clearly is not. And you don't sort of put theory into your writing and your document just by listing a bunch of references to existing theories. That's not providing a theoretical explanation. It's not just pointing to a bunch of data that might be relevant for whatever you're doing. Or relatedly, it's also not just listing a bunch of variables. Just because you've measured a bunch of things doesn't mean you have a theory that explains why something is going on. And even if you put it into a figure or a diagram, again, the point here is that it's still not what we would call a theory, an explanation of why something is going on. And even a hypothesis is then usually sort of a more specific manifestation of a more general theory. And a hypothesis or prediction it's not necessarily a theory as such. So just sort of to highlight that these are 5 things that often are sort of intermixed or confused with theory. And what we mean with the word theory in social science and natural science is something different. We can call it sort of a term that helps us explain observed regularities, or I sort of prefer this explanation here. It's sort of an abstraction. It's a way of abstracting away enough of the world's confusion to develop a pointed explanation of something. So a theory involves a reduction of what's going on here. It's a simplified explanation of why or how something is happening or why it's not happening. So that's what a theory is trying to do. It's trying to take maybe sort of a longish story on what is going on in the world, and then it's trying to pinpoint it's trying to abstract away from all those different elements that are not sort of part of the theory as such. And Dan O'Reilly's work on bionicles, it's not really, there's a lot of stuff going on for his theory that is not really relevant about what happens in the workplace and how managers manage and meaning, etc. He's focused on one particular aspect of how meaningful work is perceived to be, and that's then his theory of how productive employees can end up being. So he's looking at work life, which of course involves a lot of stuff and emotions and opinions and management and money and all sorts of stuff, and he's then trying to abstract away a lot of the confusion about what's going on at the workplace and saying, here is a theory that explains part of why some people are more productive than others, or some workplaces are more productive than others. It's about the meaning that people find it. So that's his attempt of abstracting away enough of the world's confusion to get to the, well, what is it that drives productivity from his perspective. The Research Design 2001 book chapter also has sort of a similar angle on this. It makes the distinction between descriptive and explanatory research. So descriptive research is just showing, for instance, the age profile of a population, or showing that how mortality rates is related to the age of people who have COVID-19, or as illustrated in this picture here, how social inequality might be rising or declining over time. So just looking at this figure, this diagram, you don't get a theory of why inequality is sort of has this U kind of shape. It's just showing us that over time, we are looking at data from 1920 to 2014, there seems to be some systematic changes going on in different countries in the world. Details of this diagram is not really important. The point is, we can make a diagram that tells us something about the world, but it doesn't explain to us why. So good description can then provoke this why question. So we can look at this graph of how inequality has changed over time. Inequality here meaning share of total income going to the top 1%. So it was high early in the 20th century, then it was lower after the Second World War, and then it's becoming high again. The share of total income going to the top 1% is at its peak since 1900. So again, this is not explaining why this is the case. It's just showing, look, here is something that's going on that could be interesting. And the why would then go to, well, why is inequality increasing and declining? So that would be the explanatory research that explains what's going on. And answering such a why question involves developing some kind of causal explanation. Something happened in, I don't know, the 1980s, whether it was Reagan's tax cuts or whatever it was. the American president, Ronald Reagan. Whatever sort of the explanation is, that we are trying to come up with reasons for why is inequality changing over time. So this is explanatory research. It's trying to establish a theory and answering a why question. So attempts to answer the why question in social science are theories, as written on page 5 in the Research Design 2001 document. So to continue a bit on this distinction between description and an explanation, we, for instance, know that the amount of time that a cricket, the amount of chirps it makes per second, is strongly related to how warm it is. Causal connection is quite clear. It's not the number of sounds a cricket makes that leads the temperature outside to be warmer or colder. It's the temperature that sort of is influencing the number of sounds a cricket makes. But just because we then know that these things are associated does not mean that we have a specific why or how explanation. It doesn't mean that we know how temperature influences the cricket. So we can have a description that can even predict. So we could predict the number of sounds a cricket is going to make, but we don't know why. We don't have a theoretical explanation except, well, temperature seems to play a role. But we don't have the how or why explanations. This is just to point out that we can actually have descriptions of stuff that even involve some kind of prediction, but still doesn't get to the how or the why. I'll get a little bit more back to prediction in a little while. If we take the elementary school quasi-experiment example that we've had before, it shows, the test data is showing that depending on when you take the test, your score decreases if you take it later in the day. That in itself is just showing data, is just being descriptive, is just showing, look, this is what is going on. But the paper then also has a theoretical explanation by saying that the time of day affects students' test performance because, this is a quote from the paper, over the course of a regular day, students' mental resources gets taxed and they become increasingly fatigued. They also call it cognitive fatigue, becoming tired. And this is then why they underperform on a standardized test when they become more tired. So later in the day, more tired, therefore worse performance. Just saying that they later in the day perform worse wouldn't explain to us why that would be the case. We could predict how well they would do, but it wouldn't contain this theoretical explanation if we just stated it's later in the day, because who knows what then the reason could be. It could be the fact that the rooms, we didn't open the windows in the room, and that's why the air quality was worse, and that's why cognitive processes didn't really function as well in these kids. That wouldn't be cognitive fatigue in the same sense. That would be sort of a different kind of why explanation. So this is just to point to an example that we've had before, and sort of try to emphasize that this is the abstracted theoretical explanation. There's of course a lot of stuff going on with kids. It's not just about them becoming cognitive fatigue. It's becoming later in the day, they've been awake for more hours, they can become more restless, emotions, hungry. I mean, there's a bunch of stuff that could be going on, but this explanation is abstracting away a lot of what's happening in the world, just focusing on the fatigue. That's their explanation. I also want to highlight that we can see many different types or levels of theoretical explanations. We could look at the question of why we see graffiti on trains, and then we could go for what we would call a sociological explanation. Something about kids nowadays feeling alienated, they don't have any job, they don't have an identity, and then they sort of get together and express themselves through graffiti. That would be what we could call a sociological explanation for this behavior. But one could also go for an economic explanation and say, well, theoretically, the reason why we see more graffiti on trains is because the cars were not protected, because we didn't have the funds to do so. So the companies that own these cars, they couldn't protect them. So economically speaking, this is the reason for why we see more graffiti. And of course, both of these reasons and both of these theoretical explanations can be true and they can be complementary, but they are certainly different. They are different kinds of abstractions of what's going on in the real world. Sociology would usually look at sort of what happens between people, and economics would usually look at how lack of money or resources explain stuff. Similarly, one could, for instance, ask the question, who becomes an entrepreneur? And we can point to individual factors, how risk averse you are. There might be some genes that drives this. It might be about the skills you have at the educational level, but we can also point to structural factors that the people that become an entrepreneur are those that live in countries with a strong safety net or a certain tax system or a certain national culture. So again, just an example of how the same question, who becomes an entrepreneur, why do people become entrepreneurs, we can provide different abstractions of reality and focus on different kinds of factors at the individual level or structural level. Of course, we can do both. Maybe it's a mix. Maybe certain kind of genes sort of, or risk aversions only really matter in certain tax systems. Who knows? These things could be interconnected. Again, we can sort of come up with more examples that illustrate the same things. This is just to highlight that we can see many different kinds of theoretical explanations, and especially in business administration and economics, we will be interested in different angles at the individual level, at the societal, structural level, and different explanations can be put in place depending on what we're going for. And again, these are of course not necessarily competing. They can be complementary. They can both explain part of reality. Okay, so this is just to highlight that we can see many different kinds of theories, and it can be important when we want to understand something to think about, well, what kind of explanation am I going for here? Is it at an individual level, behavioral level? Is it at a more sort of organizational level, or is it about differences between countries and cultures, or sort of whatever the context is? That doesn't mean that one always has to think of all the different kinds of angles and levels. Just be aware of, well, what level am I on in my attempt to explain whatever I'm trying to explain. I mentioned something briefly about prediction before. I want to sort of follow up on that. Does an explanation necessarily imply a prediction? So does a theoretical explanation necessarily imply a prediction? If you want to, you can pause the video just to think about it. And for instance, think about, let's say I can provide a theoretical explanation of why someone or a certain kind of individual won Oscars in recent years. Does that mean you can also predict future winners? So if you think or claim you've explained something, does that necessarily mean that you've predicted? A couple of thoughts here. First of all, as Nelson highlights, time changes. So you could imagine that whatever explanation that fitted the Oscars in 1990s might not be a useful explanation of what's going on in this decade, because times has changed, the environment and who are becoming great actors and what movies are being made can have changed. So in that sense, we should maybe acknowledge that predictions don't necessarily hold through over all time periods. One should also think about what prediction actually means, because we could take historical Oscar data and split it in two and use data from one half to predict the other half, which would be not a prediction of the future, but it would be a prediction of data. So the word prediction is not completely straightforward. But I think the key point that I want to make here is that there are also fundamentally different conceptions of what we expect from theories. What is our level of ambition? What should our theory be able to do? And referring back to lesson 6, positivism would then say, well, we shouldn't just explain stuff. I mean, theories should be law-like. It should be like a law that might just be probabilities. It doesn't mean it has to happen like this every single time. But a theory should, about how money motivates people if they are doing simple tasks, that should also be able to predict that in the future, if I either pay people money or don't not pay people money for completing a simple task, I should be able to predict who completes the most. So positivism can be associated with a standpoint or an assumption that says, well, this is the ambition that we should have. Truth should be achieved, and that implies a prediction. While constructivism in particular then would say, well, it doesn't necessarily make sense to always expect us to be able to predict the future. We are trying to understand how the world works, and we are constructing these explanations, and we realize that as time and society and people unfold and change, then the underlying phenomena and structures that we are trying to explain, they also change over time. So we shouldn't necessarily expect predictions, because we shouldn't be surprised if the world changes. That's the whole point of sort of us living in it and theorizing about it, is that we can create new technology that changes the way people behave. And just because we couldn't predict that doesn't mean that we couldn't explain how things usually were. So just to say that there's also another, constructivism is an assumption about what science is and can do. That does not necessarily imply that we should be able to predict things. And you will see in different scientific disciplines and in different fields, and again, according to these different philosophies of science, you will encounter different expectations. And in big parts of economics, you will, for instance, see that prediction is more or less expected. Again, when I say prediction, I mean probabilities. That doesn't mean that Dan O'Reilly in his Bionicle experiment will always be able to predict that those in the meaningful condition will build more Bionicles, but on average, they will build more Bionicles. That's the point that positivism is going for here. So this was some angles on what theory is, what does it do, what is a theoretical explanation. It's an abstraction of whatever is going on in the world into a more simplified explanation. A theory is not going to cover everything that's going on, but Dan O'Reilly's theory on Bionicles and how, well, his theory on how meaning at a workplace is related to productivity, of course, doesn't incorporate everything that's going on in an organization, but that's also the point. It's looking at in a sort of abstraction. It's trying to look at only parts of the reality that is going on. Another way of trying to highlight and provide the essence of what a theory is by this guy Whetten, who says there are 4 elements. There is a what, that's the factors that we sort of are interested in, that could, for instance, be the variables that we've measured. Then there is a how. I mean, how are these factors related? We want to get to the why. What's the explanation? Why do we see this dynamic? And then we might want to say, well, it depends. There are some boundary conditions. This theory is not going to work for everyone all over the world. We can take Bernstein as an example. There's some factors about transparency at an organizational workplace and how productive people are. These are sort of some of the what factors involved. His claim then is that there is a link between how transparent the workplace is and how productive people at the workplace are. And the why is then going to how they are not being interrupted and how they can tweak the way that they try to complete their work at this mobile phone factory. That gets to the underlying why, the explanation of the underlying dynamics. And he's also highlighting that, well, this works on a Chinese factory floor, but that does not necessarily mean that his explanation of the impact of transparency, of others being able to see what you do, that will always hold true in all other contexts. Notice that prediction is not an element of these sort of, is not one of the 4 elements in Whetten's description of what a theory actually consists of. And finally, also just to link it back to research designs, any kind of research design can sort of more or less lead to any kind of theory. And research design is about the strengths of the causation and the validity that it establishes. It's not about whether you then, whether you end up at a specific kind of theory.